for today. I'd like to introduce our speaker, who has come a great distance over the local creeks, across the state line from Ardens, Delaware. We have Barbara Macklem today, who has a master's in liberal studies with a focus in art history from the University of Delaware. She lives in the family home in Ardens. She did not grow up in Ardens, but considers herself a newcomer. Came 20 years ago to one of the villages. She's worked in a number of museums and a professional life in human resources. Barbara is a member of the Ardens Craft Shop Museum and on the board of directors there, and she's also a member of the Museum Archives Committee. So we're going to be asking Barbara for some help in getting our own archives sorted out. We appreciate that you're doing that good work there. I want to mention that if you haven't been to the Ardens Craft Shop Museum, it's a wonderful place. It's actually in the original metalworking craft building, which is right on the Ardens Green, and they are open on Sundays from 1 to 3 p.m. On Wednesday evenings, it seems like a very smart way to spend a Wednesday evening, 7:30 to 9 p.m. or by appointment. And there's some information up front on the museum and what Ardens is doing. They're going to be celebrating, as I understand it, 15 years as a museum this October. And a new exhibition opens on October 20th, celebrating those 15 years with 15 treasures from the museum's collection. And so I really encourage you to go to Ardens to support what they are doing there. They are our sister community, founded a year before Rose Valley. And on a personal note, I want to thank very much Barbara and also Sadie for taking me under their wing probably about 5 years ago when Thunderbird Lodge was being gifted to the Centennial Foundation. I went to the Small Museums Conference down in Ocean City, Maryland, and I didn't know anyone, or I didn't think I knew anyone, until these two wonderful ladies from Ardens took me under their wing, introduced themselves, and taught me a little bit about running a small museum. And they've been really helpful and supportive, coming to events ever since. And so this is very much a larger community effort. And so I want to thank you. Without further ado, Barbara Macklem.
Thank you. Ryan, thank you. That was a much more effusive introduction, I think, than it needed to be. But when Sadie and I first we looked at the attendance list at the Small Museum Association conference, and we looked down and we saw Rose Valley. Rose Valley. We need to find out who this guy is. So we trapped him into dinner with us. And then I think we trapped him into dinner the second night as well. So it was a great way to meet and to bring our two communities together. So that's fun. It is a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon in Thunderbird Lodge. These surroundings and the memories they evoke really are a welcome respite from the problems and divisions that we face every day. And I think just your attendance here this afternoon on a hot, it's still summer afternoon when there is so much else going on. It means that you welcome the same respite that we do. So it's lovely to see you all here. And I would like to thank Ryan and the Rose Valley Historical Society at Thunderbird Lodge, is that right, for inviting me here. I have some friends and colleagues from Ardens, and also a couple of ladies I just met who made an advanced visit to Ardens this afternoon. So I hope their questions will not be too difficult. I bring you greetings from your sister communities in Delaware. There are 3 villages known as the Ardens: Ardentown, and Ardencroft. And I've titled our talk this afternoon as a living experiment, because in many ways this began as an experiment in 1900. And here we are in 2019, and we're still going strong. But we still we still haven't got it quite right. So we are still an experiment. Let me tell you first a little bit about the Ardens and who they are. It probably is best. This is a beautiful illustration by a lady named Louise Roberts, who with her husband ran a printing press originally here, then moved to Arden and eventually to New Hope. But we have a superb collection of her drawings that we reproduce, and this is the welcoming style. You'll hear a little bit more about that later. A map of the Ardens. So it's probably best to start with a clear understanding of where the Ardens are and where they can be found. We're in Brandywine 100, in a section of northern Delaware, about 9 miles north of Wilmington, right off the, if anybody's been down there, the Harvey Road exit of I-95. There are, at the last census, about 475 residents in Arden, 275 in Arden Town, and about 265 in Arden Croft. And I'm going to use this handy pointer and show you where the 3 villages are, I hope. This area is all Arden, the original village founded in 1900. That is Arden Town, which was the second village founded in 1922. They'll be celebrating their 100th anniversary in 3 years, so we're already making plans for that. And then the smallest, the last one, is here. It's Arden Croft. That was founded in 1950.
Can you show us where the swim club is in the Guild Hall?
Surely. The swim club and the Guild Hall have been asked for, so let me show you. But first, let me show you where the museum is, because that's much more important. Right there is the museum on the edge of the village green. The Field Theater, which you'll hear about, is here. You walk down this road, across here, across at the light, and here is the Guild Hall and the swim club. If you wanted to know where the original swim club was, it was in Naaman's Creek, up here. But we don't use that anymore, at least not on purpose. So those are the 3 villages. There's about, as I said, about 1,000 residents altogether. And they all play a very active role in their communities. At the most recent elections we had for Arden, 17% of the eligible voters didn't just vote, they agreed to run for office, which is why you can tell we are definitely a volunteer-run organization in terms of all of our towns. But 17% of people willing to run for office, I think that's a pretty impressive degree. And it was fun counting the votes too, because there were so many people who ran. It is a real participatory democracy. The 3 communities, we cover around 335 acres, and it is almost exclusively residential. There are a few home-based businesses which operate here due to changes in the local laws, in the county laws, and those county laws were changed with an awful lot of encouragement from residents of the Ardens. But in order to tell you the whole story of the Ardens, we need to go all the way back to 1879. Not exactly a history lesson, but we need to go there. This is Henry George. In 1879, he published his seminal work, Progress and Poverty. He was a journalist, a printer, a politician, and of course an economist. The subtitle of this work is, and remember this is a 19th century title, An Inquiry into the Causes of Industrial Depression and an Increase of Want with an Increase of Wealth, which I think would apply today just as it did in 1879. One of his strongly held beliefs was that all men were entitled, equally entitled, to the use of the earth. He saw many societal problems, and he felt that they could be changed and make it possible for communities to function at their highest level. He proposed what he called a land value tax, and that is also called a single tax, and that is how all three of the Ardens operate and collect their revenue. He believed that only the land should be taxed and not any improvements that individuals have made to that land. And he also felt very strongly that no one should be permitted to hold land without paying to the community the value of the privilege thus accorded, and from the fund so raised, all expenses of government should be paid. He saw with a single tax we could support the community, do what needed to be done, and to be fair to everyone. This was a very radical idea for his time, as you can imagine, but his followers were fervent supporters, well, I should say were and are fervent supporters, because there's a couple in the audience, so I need to include them. Think about the United States in the late 19th century. It was a country in vast transition. We had survived a devastating civil war. The 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia and the 1893 Chicago World Exhibition, Columbia World Exhibition in Chicago, had attracted, really for the first time, real international interest in this fledgling country out here between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific, the Atlantic Sea and the Pacific Ocean, sorry. The movement from people from farms to cities had begun again in earnest, and immigrants had really begun to arrive in search of their own American dream. We think that technology today is marching us forward. In this era, railroads, electricity, telephone, all sorts of communications were again, as always, poised to revolutionize the world we live. There were Wall Street panics in 1873, 1882, and in 1893. Stock values were overinflated, and their collapse led to business failures and personal hardships and, of course, unemployment. But during the late 19th century, many individuals and groups were searching for a better way to live, a way to exist in a rapidly changing world. So if you think of the growth of camp meetings, of church-based resort communities in the mountains and in the beach, and the development of settlement houses in urban centers, these were all part of a search for a better way of life. It is in this rather raucous environment we find the founding of the village of Arden in 1900 by, first of all, G. Frank Stevens. He was a sculptor, and another name familiar to you, William Lightfoot Price, architect both of Philadelphia. As well as being artists, Stevens and Price were Georgists, followers of the economic philosophies developed by Henry George. Philadelphia was one of the leading cities in the nation with an active community of artists, universities, and cultural societies. With all the changes happening in the world at large, Philadelphia remained a city of relatively traditional values. Growing neighborhoods absorbed the influx of immigrants, and while New York and Chicago raced to build skyscrapers, Philadelphia began and maintained for many years the custom that no building would be built higher than William Penn's head atop City Hall. I do rather miss that a little bit. Frank Stevens was active in many of the artistic and socially minded groups in the city, including the Sketch Club and the Society of Ethical Culture, for Ethical Culture, which was a group known for its support of reform movements. During the same period, Will Price was also becoming interested in the ideas of men like William Morris and John Ruskin. Theories that rejected industrialization and commercialism of modern life with a view to a return to a simpler existence and an appreciation for craftsmanship. Stevens was in fact living in Philadelphia, and Price was nearby in the suburbs, although his offices were in the city. One of Stevens' business was a company that produced terracotta architectural ornamentation So it seems very likely that two men met through business dealings and found themselves like-minded reformers, soon to become warriors in the single tax campaign. It was probably Stevens who organized the single tax invasion of Delaware. The single taxers realized that it would be hard to convert the entire population of Pennsylvania to this dramatic change in tax policies, so they conceived an idea. Their approach was a bit more carefully refined. The group would campaign in the nearby small state of Delaware, convince the population of the rightness of their cause, win enough seats to control state government, and institute the land value tax as government policy. Pretty good idea. The single tax campaign in Delaware began in earnest, as this group shows you how earnest they were, June 16, 1895, in advance of the 1896 general election. This group of campaigners, this photo was taken as they prepared to leave Philadelphia, a stalwart group with knapsacks full of literature and faces full of determination. Now, Price does not appear in the photograph, but a contemporary article in the single tax newspaper Justice stated that he was part of the initial wave of campaigners. The group spent the next year throughout the state. They were run out of several towns. They wrangled with communities over free speech and the right to assemble. And they were jailed more than once. I think it's interesting that they were so proud of their jail time in Dover that not only did they have a photograph taken, they added in print all of their names around the photograph. So there could be no mistake that these people were truly in earnest about their campaign. But they persevered. They created a slate of candidates. Henry George himself came to Delaware on a number of occasions and spoke to the crowds that were assembled and helped with the effort. At the end of the campaign, the Georgists won approximately 3% of the votes cast. Not quite enough to take over state government. Not to be defeated, it was Will Price who proposed to Stevens that they create, and I quote, an arts and crafts colony that should let us work out the truths of Henry George and William Morris. They looked first in New Jersey, but eventually found a 162-acre farm in northern Delaware. The property was 2 miles from the Delaware River, a very short 10-minute walk from a convenient B&O train station, the Baltimore and Ohio, and near the crossroads of a village called Grubb's Corner. On June 12, 1900, Stevens purchased the Derrickson farm for $9,000. 162 acres for $9,000. And the local farming community thought this man was crackers, and maybe we could find some more like him to buy the land that isn't worth farming. He had $2,500 in cash, and the rest was in a mortgage. The land itself was bounded on two sides by wooded stream beds, and on the other side by a small two-lane road, which, if you know the area, is now Marsh Road. It was called Hay Road at the time. This is the very small road that ran between the two parcels. This is Grubb Road, as seen from Harvey Station, about 1900. The road is a little wider now, and the banks are not quite as steep, but it doesn't look too much different, except the traffic is usually whizzing past the 25-mile-an-hour speed sign, whizzing past. The farm property was undeveloped, but it was close enough to both Philadelphia and Wilmington to provide some reliable sources for necessary provisions and equipment, as well, of course, of easy access by train. The following year, the land was conveyed to a trust, the same basic arrangement that is still in use today. There were and still are 3 trustees who are elected for life and who hold the land in trust. They will offer to anyone who applies for a plot of land a 99-year lease on that land, renewable if necessary. And this lease was available to anyone who applied. Now, this arrangement is perhaps a little puzzling to sometimes. For instance, I own my house, but not the land on which it sits. And every March, the trustees send me a land rent bill, which I pay. And out of that land rent is determined by a group of assessors who are elected by the village. And in keeping with the principles of Henry George's land value tax, the assessors set a base rate, which is adjusted by various factors which are dependent upon the quality of the land that it represents. So frontage on the green or on the woods is of a higher quality, whereas on the main road, it is of lesser quality. In the early days, Arden was pretty empty. This was a farm, remember, lots of pasture land, and just a few houses. This is from 1914. The utopian experiment of Stevens and Price was influenced really by several major factors. First, of course, the economic principles of Henry George. Also, the Garden City movement, which came out of England. This campaign proposed that urban areas would include large bands of green space to promote healthy living conditions. And finally, of course, the arts and crafts movement championed by William Morris. William Morris held an economic philosophy of his own, that it was necessary to bridge the gap between rich and poor in order to develop a civil society which would benefit the entire community and indeed the world at large. And I think it's easy to see how people working and believing in the principles of Henry George and William Morris would fit together so naturally. Will Price laid out the roads and the pathways of the village. We are still, much to our visitors motoring through the village, concerned about, because these are winding roads with no pull-offs and also no light, which does make traveling at evening a little dark, a little difficult. But he based his designs on traditional English villages. And as you all know, he moved his family to Rose Valley, the new colony he founded in 1900. He remained very much a part of the life of Arden. You may recognize that the name Arden comes from the Shakespeare play As You Like It. Both Stevens and Price were Shakespeare enthusiasts and active in amateur theatrics in Philadelphia. In the play, Arden is the name of the forest in which the exiled Duke takes refuge. And the quotation, "Now I am in Arden, the more fool I," certainly comes up in village life more times than I care to think about. This is the village green. If you were to look at it today, this is the green, and right over here is the Craft Museum. So it's just out of line. In the early days, Arden was a summer colony with residents both coming from Philadelphia and also from Wilmington. It was very active though, even though people were in town for only a few months. There was an Arden Fair. The Arden Fair began in 1907 and is still held each year on the Saturday of Labor Day weekend. This is an earlier fair. This one is, actually this is late, this is 1939. The fair has its origins in the summer colony nature of Arden. It was a good opportunity for craftspeople to sell the remainder of their goods, and of course a perfect time for one last party, as everyone prepared to return to the city. The fair is still held one day only. It still features crafts, music, food, and it is also a reunion because many former residents return on that day to enjoy the day and their special ties with the village. 1908, the original deed of trust was amended. Legalese here, but important. The trustees were now required to pay the state and local taxes. There had been some question under the original lease as to whether they were actually required to do that. So 1908 it was confirmed. And the town meeting would control how the decisions on town monies were spent. Again, a change, but one that really benefited. Seems kind of dry and dusty, but it marks a real difference in the way the trust was administered and it enabled the community to continue to grow and thrive. In 1909, we had a great gift. Joseph Fells, of the Fells Naphtha soap fortune, the wealthy Philadelphia industrialist, was an ardent follower of George's principles. He paid off the mortgage for the property in 1909, freeing Stevens and his fellow trustees from that burden. And he offered the village $5,000 for the construction of 5 homes to be designed by Will Price and in a manner inspired by the classic English cottage. The village didn't know quite how to honor Fells, so in 1914 they planted an enormous oak tree on the edge of the village green, and it thrives today, and is still known as the Fells Oak. And I think Mr. Fells would be pleased with that. Fells thought that many of the homes that he had seen in Arden had been poorly designed and even more poorly constructed. And as many of those who built the houses were neither architects nor builders, his observations are fairly accurate. And some of the people who have eventually purchased and moved into some of the, quote, original houses will confirm that. They really did need a lot of work. Today there are still what we call 5 Fells cottages in the village. This is Friendly Gables. It has been added to, and it is some distance from the village green. It was once the home of the Roberts Press. Fells Cottage on Orleans Road, now greatly expanded, but the original section is still very visible. Green Gate, which is a charming house, which has marvelous mural paintings in it, which if you get to know the owner, you get to see sometimes, and that's a real treat.
Is that a Mercer tile?
I think they are Mercer tiles. Yes, they're Mercer tiles. Exactly. This is Rest Cottage on Cherry Lane, facing the green, and eventually the last of the Fells cottages. This is the lodge, which was finally completed in 1914. Now, Price did not live for any length of time in Arden, we know that. And of course, he made his family home here in Rose Valley. But we are fortunate to have his designs, his expertise, and the vision he shared with Frank Stevens, which created the village of Arden. This is the original Derrickson barn on the property when it was purchased. And in 1910, Will Price supervised the conversion of this barn into a meeting place for the Arden Club. And this is how it looks today. So they did a remarkable job. Previously, village-wide activities and lectures and magic lantern shows had taken place in the Field Theater or in the Red House. The Red House, named of course for William Morris's home in Kent, was one of the existing buildings on the property, and it was quickly converted to Frank Stevens' studio, as well as holding the Arden Forge and the woodworking shop for Don Stevens, who was Frank's son. This is how it looks today. It is the home of the Arden Craft Shop Museum, and this actually comes from our opening in 2004. So looks a little bit different, has been added to at least 3 times in the course of the, because in 1913 it was expanded again under Will Price's direction, and became known as the Craft Shop. There was a weave shop in there at one time, there was a bakery, there was even in the field, in the space to the right, thank you, of the building, there was an open-air dance pavilion. In early years, the homes were really quite modest, and even tents on wooded lots. Artisans need space to work, and the craft shop was a great solution. The lumber for these projects and for many of the homes came from the Arden Forest, where the residents had built a sawmill, and also were able to not only employ each other, but also some of the local farmers who helped manage that. Probably a good time to talk about some of the skilled artisans who've made their home in the Ardens. The Arden Forge. They created significant work for local businesses, massive hinges, locks for doors and windows, handsome candle holders, part of the Thunderbird Lodge collection, which I think will fit very neatly in my bag on the way home. Although I think Ryan knows I'm going to try that. This is a lovely example that you have right in front of you. This is from their catalog. They made candlesticks that were this high and hinges this wide, absolutely, and also much more delicate things as well. So many household furnishings. Don Stevens opened his woodworking shop and produced many examples of classic arts and crafts furniture. And this is just one of the tables that we have that Don Stevens did. So it's quite a beautiful piece. We're very fortunate to have it. Across from the craft shop was built the weave shop. And you can see the interior with the dormer windows providing light for the looms. They created fine textiles and that were sold in many of the better New York stores, as well as through their catalog. And the front room of this building, which has now been converted to apartments, whoops. This was the showroom for the weave shop. And it has sconces and hinges and door handles and all the rest that are all Arden forged pieces that are absolutely gorgeous inside. Let's see, and of course, with the looms on the second floor, I don't have a photograph, but there were sheep grazing on the Arden Green. The space for arts and crafts was very important, and housing was very important. But one of the first construction projects undertaken in the village was the Field Theater on the north side of the village green. Don Stevens, Frank's son, told the story of several locals who stopped by while Frank was working on it and were quite puzzled by a man who was building a theater instead of a house. And they were even more amazed by men who would buy land not to make a profit for themselves, but would rent out parcels of it to anyone who had the price of a lease. So there was still a lot of learning to be done and a lot of teaching to be done. Stevens did build the original homestead, probably in 1900. This was the family's home until 1909. I do want you to know, though, that these posts are still in evidence, and that this building, as modest as it looks, is still owned by a descendant of Frank Stevens. So she doesn't live in the area, but she maintains it and rents it, and was just in town over the Arden Fair weekend and they were looking at it again, came into the museum and said, her partner who was with her said, "Look at the picture. Those are the same pillars that are still there," and they are. So he may not have been an architect, but at least he knew how to put pillars on a house that would hold up the house. That was their home until 1909, their summer home until 1909. Eventually, he built this, which is known as the Founder's House. This is from the 1920s. There is a motto over the window that says, "Tomorrow is a new day." And I think that speaks very clearly of Stevens' vision and hope for the future of his colony. Life in Arden in the early days was full of activity. As I said, this is the original Arden swimming pool, which did not close until sometime in the late 50s. But they had built a beach, they had built a diving board. It was quite a popular place and was much mourned when it eventually was decided this is probably not particularly healthy to continue to swim in a creek. So it was closed and a real swimming pool was built. The pool was an area not only for fun and recreation, but some elaborate celebrations. This is a night in Venice in 1926, which has lots of lanterns and gondolas in the creek and all of the rest. Baseball games were held throughout the summer, and I don't have a baseball image to show you, but I have two little stories to tell you. One is a baseball game between Arden and Rose Valley, to be held at Rose Valley. And as I remember the story, people from Arden were coming in 2 trucks or wagons or somehow, and one of them was delayed. So when it came time to start the game, there were not enough men to field a team from Arden. So it was decided they would split the men up between the 2 villages, and they would let the women play. How radical, but that's what happened in Rose Valley with the team from the Ardens. So I think that's entirely appropriate.
What year was that?
I've been trying to remember. I think it was sometime in the 20s.
Okay, so the skirts were short.
A little bit shorter, a little shorter. But nobody was wearing shorts, that's for sure. There is another story for another time which involves Don Stevens and Upton Sinclair, who's pictured here with Frank, being arrested for playing baseball on a Sunday and being sent to the workhouse. But if we have time later, I'll tell you the whole story. Okay. The days and nights were filled with pageants and parades and activities. There's a medieval pageant from 1910. There were maypole dances to celebrate the arrival of spring, and of course, any number of suffragette parades. And just to assure you that the parades have not disappeared, this is the parade that was done for our centennial in 2000. So we still like to dress up and parade. There were artists of every discipline and utopian visionaries of all sorts. Very few of the settlers who were attracted to Arden were actually true believers in Henry George. And Stevens and his associates did not have a great deal of success converting other residents, let alone local farmers. There was no requirement to be a Georgist to get a lease in Arden. All were welcome. The rural setting was inviting, the cost was reasonable, and the opportunity to be part of an experiment in changing society was attractive to a wide range of people. Residents began to spend the winter in 1910. In 1911, electric light was available, and there were over 125 leaseholds in the village. In 1913, Kitty Ross was elected a trustee, and I would remind you that is 7 full years before women had the right to vote in the rest of the United States. They always had the right to vote in Arden. The village continued its artistic traditions, but the 1929 Depression had a severe impact on the craftspeople and the artisans. The craft shop and the weave shop were both converted to apartments in the 1930s and 40s. Frank Stevens died in 1935, and the villages could have slipped into the history books, but the residents did not let that happen. They continued their lives, practiced their crafts, and let the world swirl around them, confident in their place. Most importantly, they continued to govern themselves as an incorporated community. There continued to be many artists and craftspeople, but the population was not completely dependent upon the arts for their livelihood. Teachers, chemists, engineers, even lawyers, and many other occupations came to live in the village. And it was that diversity that would work to sustain the community. In 1922, all the leasehold space in the original village had been used, and it was time to expand. This is the Ardentown Mall in the mid-20th century. Frank Stevens found 2 farms adjacent to the current land, the current village, and with the help of his friend and fellow single taxer, Fisk Warren of Boston, purchased the Harvey and Hanby farms, a total of 109 acres for $39,000. There were 3 trustees who held the trust, as there are today, and who also set the land rents. And the village was added to in 1998 when the state of Delaware ceded 31 acres of land along the B&O tracks to the village of Ardentown. It is a nature preserve, and the state knew that by giving it to Ardentown, it would be protected and maintained. So we're very lucky to have that. Probably the most well-known feature in Ardentown is the Candlelight Dinner Theater, begun in 1931 as the Robin Hood Theater, and was a popular summer stock playhouse. Barbara Bel Geddes, Jack Klugman, Anthony Perkins, and Will Geer were among those who found work in Ardentown. Now the Candlelight Dinner Theater still operates. It still and enjoys a pretty nice reputation for an enjoyable evening's entertainment. Arden Croft is the youngest of the three Ardens. And it has a different story, a very interesting story to tell from its older neighbors. These are the original directors of the Sunset Self-Help Corporation, organized in 1947 and became known in 1950 as the Arden Croft Association. They purchased the land known at that time as Sunset Farms. It contained 63 acres, and the purchase price was $55,000. The real story behind the creation of Arden Croft can be found in the following statement from Don Stevens. And he wrote, "You are welcome hither, for here in Arden Croft we do not ask about a man's religion, nor his beliefs, nor do we hold to any theory of racial superiority. These principles were also included in the town's original bylaws. In other words, the community was in no way restricted, redlined, or secretly classified in any racial or other social term." This action is extremely rare in the early 1950s in America. It is thanks to Don Stevens and his fellow directors, who not only conceived of a better world, but took concrete steps to make it possible. Arden and Arden Town were never restricted, but had very few non-white residents. With Arden Croft, active efforts were made to recruit African Americans and other minorities, and the results were successful. There were more applicants than leaseholds available, and a lottery had to be held to choose the winners. The effort to make Arden Croft an open community paved the way for another milestone in our collective history. In 1952, a family from Arden Croft sent a request to the Arden School Board that their children be permitted to attend the school. The Arden School was designated a white school, and so these children could not legally attend. The school board discussed the matter, a public meeting was held, a petition was signed and sent to the State Board of Education. The petition informed the board that these children would be admitted to the Arden School. 2 years later, the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, ended this separate but equal concept of segregated education. Thanks to Don Stevens' vision, that of his colleagues, and the residents of the Ardens, we had already made that decision. The school flourished for many years, finally closed because of its size in 1969, and it is now very well used as a village center. I've been discussing the three different communities that describe the Ardens, and there are many instances where residents function as a single unit. One of the prime examples is an organization called ACRA, the Arden Community Recreation Association. ACRA was founded in 1947 to provide social activities and entertainment for all the residents. ACRA sponsors such varied activities as Pancake Breakfast in the Woods, coming up in early November. And you've never really had pancakes till you've had them cooked in an iron frying pan this big around over a wood fire. This is the July 4th Games on the Green, which include bicycle races and over 80s foot races and dog shows and just about everything else you can imagine. And there's also a 5-week-long summer program for the children of the Ardens. Besides the ACRA activities, residents gather together for a variety of events. There is a winter solstice celebration, which starts very early on December 21st. There are annual Shakespeare and Gilbert and Sullivan performances. And from October to May, a Saturday night community supper where different volunteers each week cook supper for an average crowd of 150 people. And you've never really been part of that until you've made crab cakes for 150 people. And I can speak to that because the museum has done that on several occasions, and it is a lot of fun. All of these events help to bring the community together and provide many opportunities for young and old to enjoy themselves. I would like to think that if the original residents came back, they would feel just as comfortable in the Ardens of today as they did when Will Price and Frank Stevens began their experimental village. At one time, there were 17 what were called enclaves of economic rent in the country. And number of these were founded by both Will Price and Frank Stevens were active in the founding. However, today there are 4: Fairhope, Alabama, and Arden, Ardentown, and Ardencroft. So I think we might be doing something right somewhere along the way. If there's one idea I'd like you to remember, it's that the Ardens are a community. We were in 1908, and we still are today. We are separate incorporated towns, and we govern by town meeting. Almost every elected official is a volunteer. We assess our own taxes to meet local and state obligations. We maintain and care for the forests, the greens, and the streams. We sponsor and enjoy social activities for all ages. We have our own memorial gardens or cemetery, so you really never have to leave. We protect a tree canopy of over 73%. We have 5 theater venues for everything from Shakespeare to Broadway to folk to rock to Cajun, bagpipes and drums. We actively support a significant number of artists, artisans, musicians, actors, sculptors, writers, and so many more, who provide the villagers with inspiration in their daily lives. And we are still growing, evolving, and looking to the future. Life here contains artists and actors, advocates and dissenters, philosophers and realists, and all are welcome. When Frank Stevens and the early settlers built a style to which marked the path from the railroad station to the village green, they carved the words, "You are welcome hither," on the front. Whoops. As this visitor was welcomed to speak at Arden Day in 1910. It says, "You are welcome hither," and on the back, it's just as important. It says, "If we do meet again, we shall smile." I hope that you, like Will Price, will visit the Ardens and see for yourself how well the experiment works. Thank you. Thank you. You've all been very patient.
So I used to live in Highland Woods.
Oh, yes. Hello, neighbor.
Hi. And Arden actually purchased, there was a property there that had been developed, et cetera. And so Arden does that periodically to preserve land and to bring it back to its natural state. Is that?
That's correct. See if I can go back.
You want the map?
Yeah. Can you do that? Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Highland Woods is across Namens Creek on our pseudo-northern border. And some property became available and the village of Arden made the purchase. Not without discussion, but it made the purchase. Oops. There we go. Okay. We're talking about an area along here on this side of the creek. Okay. Several years ago, the village of Arden also purchased what is known as the Avery property, which runs along here. This was a stand of ground. I can't remember how many acres. 5 acres. Thank you. My archive, my Google in the back row there. 5 acres, they were going to be, the owner of the acres was ready to sell them, and she was making a move to create a residential community and put a number of houses on the property. we were already struggling with stream drainage from that area. There is a small stream that runs along here, as you can see, and all the way down through Arden Croft. And so the village took out a mortgage and bought the ground and paid it off to, as you have said, to help preserve that natural surrounding and to maintain, really, it's lovely because it helps to maintain a border between ourselves and a rapidly encroaching Brandywine 100 community. Sir?
I'd like to understand a little bit more about how the sale tax process works. So when you say you have to do your commitments to the local governments, I'm assuming that's county, state, and schools?
Correct.
And so the individual homeowners don't pay those taxes, the trust does?
Correct. I own my house, I rent my land, and I have a 99-year lease on it. It used to be renewable. If somebody if somebody got a new name on a leasehold, then you just added their name to the leasehold, but lawyers got involved in the 60s, so that changed. So what happens is that the Newcastle County and the state school board review all of the holdings in the village of Arden and the other two villages. They create what they see as the appropriate tax for that community. And this means that Newcastle County is, of course, using its assessments, and the school taxes are based on the percentage that school taxes are based on. That bill goes to the trustees. The trustees then review that and also add in other monies they feel that are necessary to make the village work. Something to keep the roads plowed in the winter and the trash collected, and also donations to all of the activities such as the library, the archives, and many other activities. That total is then looked at by the assessors. The assessors are a committee that are elected every year. They look at where our current tax rate is set, which is a square footage rate for each leasehold. And they see if, based on that current rate, will it be enough to pay all of the taxes and the other expenses. If it's not, then it is adjusted or changed, and that is then reflected in the land rent bill.
Do you have the right to dispute what the county tells you you're worth? Yes.
You do, yes. Yeah, you do, yeah. It doesn't happen too often in Northern Delaware. One of the issues, which is coming up very soon, is that the county is looking at a new assessment. And that is going to impact not just Arden, well, it's going to impact the three Ardens, but it's going to impact a significant portion of Newcastle County.
Just to chime in on the county tax. You know, we get a bill from the county based on the assessment of the structure on the leasehold.
So they do take into value.
But the county does. The bill the county sends to trustees is a bill, in essence, tallying up all the values of all the structures on the and the land too. But in the village of Arden, since we do not believe with George's that you should tax the effect of labor, because our approach is, if you put addition on your home, you hired plumbers, electricians, and flooring contractors, whatever, you've done a very good thing for the community. But the county raises your taxes because of that, so you were penalized. But in Arden, that bill gets divided up among everybody. So if you decide to put $100,000 addition on your house, we all suffer with that, or enjoy that, because to me, a rising tide lifts all boats. Everybody gets to share it. And so that's one of the big changes that keeps us being Georgians, is that we do not penalize it with the effect.
And it does make a difference. I recently I built a sunroom on my house, which I'm sure will affect my assessment.
You just go back.
Their taxes are going to go up, but there you go. But I used a local contractor who hired a local painter, who hired a local electrician, and we bought the stuff, locally. And as Rodney says, this was the principle behind the Georgist idea. The idea is we have the same size property, and I build a little house with a cottage, or little house, it's usually a cottage and a garden. You build 5 bedrooms, 6 baths, swimming pool, room for a pony. That's what you decided to do with your money. I decided to do something else. Why should you be penalized because that's how you decided to spend your money? The land is the same. The land, you haven't changed the land, you've just put something on top of it. We've been doing it for 19 years with many discussions, many changes, and obviously when it started, county taxes and school taxes were quite different than they are now. But still, all 3 communities have been able to continue to make this work.
Under the theory of, taxes based on land, are there any historic easements used in these communities to maintain at minimum the facade, perhaps, of historic buildings?
Not necessarily. However, about 50% of the ground in Arden, and in I think all 3 Ardens, is open land. It's forest or green or streams. So it is not taxed. So that takes away, a large portion. So that is something that the county does. But we have no historic easements, although we are in the National Register of Historic Places.
Are there any commercial enterprises in Arden? Are the theaters considered commercial?
Candlelight Theater is a commercial establishment, operates as a dinner theater. The other, also across the road from Candlelight, is Ivy Gables, which is an assisted living community. And right on the corner of Marsh Road and Sherwood is the Auditorium, which is in a tiny little building which used to house the Ardens sub shop. And it is a curious little museum of odd things, which have attracted the attention of the owner, and she exhibits them in this building. So, but that's really it in terms of commercial establishments. That's why whenever we have a gathering, there's no place to go for a cup of coffee. So the end of a gathering always says, bring a dish to share. So that's what always happens.
When you go to sell your home, obviously disclosure laws, et cetera. So you're sharing with people with the land tax, et cetera, and how it all works and whatnot. So the value, again, of the property is really based, from your perspective, is based on the structure itself. You own all that. But then people need to understand and appreciate and acknowledge the land use.
And what she's is indicating is that when property is sold, the buyer needs to be fully aware of what is going on in terms of the land rent and the value of the houses. It is an interesting thing that in the early years, banks would not give mortgages on houses in Arden because they could not conceive of the fact that somebody didn't own their land. So first the Rhythesian Guild and then the Arden Building and Loan was started. And so there is still in existence. It's a small state-chartered bank in Arden, and it was developed primarily to offer the opportunity for mortgages when the real banks or the big banks wouldn't do it. I ran into this. I needed to get a home equity loan for my sunroom. I went to my bank where I had banked for years. They were recently bought out by an out-of-state concern. At the time I went for this home equity loan. I'm talking to the lady I always chat with. Oh yes, I'm sure we can do that, not a problem. She starts typing in my information and says, oh wait a minute, you live in Arden. And I said, yes. Well, we can't write home equity loans in Arden anymore. I said, well, the old bank did, yes, but the new bank won't. So I went up the street to another still local bank where I've had a savings account since before I was born and asked about a home equity loan. And the lady said, oh, I'm sure we can do that. I said, well, I live in Arden. And she looked at me very kindly and said, well, that's nice. So they were willing to write a home equity loan for my place in Arden, even though I don't own the land. So it is still an issue. One of the things I think, though, that is interesting is that I would say the people who move to Arden who don't understand the Arden community are few and far between. People come primarily because this is their interest. They want to be part of a community. They want to be part of amateur theatrics, or they want to sing in Gilbert and Sullivan, or they want to go to the Arden Fair and sit in the beer garden and drink, and listen to music for 8 hours. So it's all part and parcel, and I think most of our residents are not too surprised. It's just the banks that need convincing, as they always do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.